Now is the time to lean in, to listen, and to act. Welcome to The Quiet Life. Hi guys, welcome to this week of The Quiet Life, and we are back, and I'm very excited for this conversation that we have today. Now, I am joined by Siena Castellon, who is an internationally recognized, multi-award-winning autism advocate and anti-bullying campaigner. She is an author of the Spectrum Girls Survival Guide, How to Grow Up Awesome and Autistic, which I love, which is a guide for neurodiverse girls navigating a neurotypical world. She's also the founder of Neurodiversity Celebration Week, which raises awareness for students with special education needs and disabilities and celebrates their strengths. Her mission is to reduce the stigma and myths and misconceptions associated with having these conditions and really create a community that SEND students do not have to go at it alone. You know, she's a resilient and passionate person and speaks from her own experiences, as she herself has autistic, dyslexic, and dyspraxic, and has ADHD. And you're only 18, and this is amazing. So thank you so much for joining, Siena. How are you today?
Oh, I'm fine, and thank you for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you today.
Yeah, well, I mean, thank you so much for joining. And obviously, I've just read through kind of such a big introduction, and there's so much stuff that you do and you've done, but even more what you represent. And I thought today, I mean, and what's really important with this podcast conversation is really expanding the awareness on conversations that I think are really important for people to hear and know more about, and really make it something that is supportive, and we can really start to learn from people like yourself. But I thought the easiest way for us to start, and for people listening, is just to hear a little bit about you and what it was like growing up and what it was like in your family. I mean, just what is life like for you? And tell us a little bit more about Siena.
Sure. Just with my neurodiversity journey, I guess, I come from a family where my mom is completely neurotypical. She was very athletic at school. She has, really good spelling, so no dyslexia or dyspraxia like I have. And so growing up, I was different in many ways,
Mm,
and my parents, weren't quite sure why. When I was younger, I struggled with spelling, and it was something that was really difficult for me, but my reading was fine. And so my mom thought maybe there might be some dyslexia here because her spelling is rather bad. And I would always confuse my B's and my D's. And so she
right.
had to do
Okay.
all these like mnemonics and games with me and be like, oh, B-E-D and bed. And you had to like do these like things. And eventually she went to my school and said, could she be dyslexic? And the school said, well, no, because she can read. And people who are dyslexic cannot read.
Right.
And my mom was like, oh, okay. And they said it in a very definitive way. And my mom felt like, well, these are educational professionals and I have no experience in this, so I'll just take their lead. And then it took me a while to get diagnosed with dyslexia after that. And there were other things like when I was younger, I had a hip problem. And so it meant that I was in a wheelchair for a portion of my life. And when I came out of the wheelchair, I was very uncoordinated and I really struggled at sport. And my mom thought, okay, well, maybe it's just because she was in a wheelchair. Maybe she just wasn't used to playing sport with the other kids. And then eventually we realized that I had a motor coordination disorder, which was dyspraxia. And I got diagnosed with that. And getting diagnosed with dyspraxia was a real game changer for me because before there was a lot of stigma to being bad at sport, especially when you're tall, because I was always the tallest kid in the class. And
Right.
so teachers would think, she's going to be amazing at sport. And then I would just be a hot mess, like an absolute disaster. Like I would like catch a ball up here when it's coming from below kind of stuff
Right.
because
Yeah.
I'm so uncoordinated. Like I trip over my own feet kind of uncoordinated. And so it took me a while to get diagnosed, but once I did, I felt like there was a reason that I was so, clumsy. And then with autism, that was one that took a really long time to get diagnosed. And it was a difficult one because I knew that I was different my whole life. And my parents, they thought of autism as like the way the media presents it. And
Sure.
normally in the media, it's like the guy from Big Bang or Rain Man. It's like a man who struggles to communicate and who's incredibly nerdy and has these like special interests. And it's a presentation that wasn't quite what I was having. Because with girls, you can mask and you can kind of pick up body language from other people. And so what I would do is I would stay up all night watching movies, and I would look at characters my age and I'd study their behavior. And so I'd be like, oh, okay, look at the way that she, enters this conversation, and look at her body language, and look at things that this character would say. And I'd memorize lines that this character would say, and I'd
Yeah.
practice their body language. And so when I would be in class and when I would be around my friends at school, from the outside, I didn't have that many social issues. But it was all because I was spending hours of my life scripting conversations. I remember being in like year 5, and I sat in front of the mirror for like 2 hours practicing how to say hello to somebody because I struggled with that. And it was a lot of effort. But I wasn't presenting as someone who had really difficult social interaction problems. And so it took me a while to get diagnosed. And once I did, it really helped my mental health and just everything, because I no longer felt so different and so ostracized and so like, why do I have to stay up till 2 a.m. practicing conversations when it comes so naturally to everybody else? And so, and that's what kind of drove me to write my book and to the Spectrum Girl Survival Guide, How to Grow Up Awesome and Autistic. Because,
Wow.
I had a difficult experience at school, and I just wanted to give some tips and tricks to other girls who are going through that.
That's really amazing. And you're so young, and I say that in a really inspired way. And I think even though that you are young in age, your journey has been long. I mean, can we go back just a little bit? Because I'm very interested to almost talk about each of those aspects of your life and how that made you feel. I mean, when you first noticed when you were younger and you had those conversations with your mom and she had them at school about your dyslexia, I mean, did you how did that make you feel? What was that like? Or did you even realize that it was that complex, kind of that you could read but you couldn't spell?
Yeah, I mean, I really struggled with it because with my reading, I would put a lot of effort into it. I think that you cut out. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah, I can hear you.
Oh,
Can you
sorry.
hear me?
Okay.
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
You cut out and then you froze, and so I just wanted. Okay, so with my dyslexia, I would put a lot of effort into my reading at school. And when I would come home, I would just spend all my time reading because I was a real bookworm. And I had a very advanced vocabulary because of
Mm,
that. And I remember my mum got me tested, and I had a vocabulary that was like 5 or 6 years above my chronological age. But I was misspelling words like witch. I would spell like witch as in like which one do you want,
yeah,
as witch as in the witch with the hat kind of thing. And I
yeah.
would do that all the time. And I would write a creative writing story, and I'd spell the same word 4 or 5 different times. And I was constantly confusing stuff. And it felt like I was the only one kind of going through that, because with other kids, they wouldn't know how to spell a word, and they'd learn it. And then
Yeah.
from that point on, they'd spell it correctly. Out this there situation. And I've been doing it for the last 2 years and nothing's happened. Like
Sure.
in the car on the way to school, my mom would constantly test my spelling, and I would put all this effort into it. And it wouldn't accomplish anything. And I remember, I was really into my creative writing stories. And it would just be so heartbreaking to write something and then it come back with all this red pen
Yeah.
over like, oh, this spelling mistake and this spelling mistake. And it was a spelling mistake in every line. And I just knew that there was something up with it. But people were telling me it's not dyslexia. And so I was like, okay, well, then I just have to put more effort into it. And so I would work really hard. And then teachers would tell my parents, she's not dyslexic, she's lazy,
Right.
because she's not trying hard enough to to learn her spelling words, and she's not trying hard enough to, do her punctuation when she writes.
Yeah.
And it really hurt because, to throw something around like a child's lazy or a child's stupid, they're very loaded. And to tell, a 7-year-old that, it can be really hurtful. And for a long time, it stuck with me because I wouldn't want to write, any essay. It could be a history essay, an English essay. It was always a struggle because I felt like I was going to hand it in and no one was going to care what I wrote. They were just going to care how I wrote it with my spelling and my punctuation.
And it is so important to recognize that for people listening to this, is that, words and labels and the way that we almost put people in boxes can be such an unfair way to treat people because of the impact that it has. I mean, in those earlier years, not only with the dyslexia and the dyspraxia, I mean, how did that impact, your kind of relationships at school? Did you kind of have, did that kind of, was that a nice place to be? Do you have friends around you that kind of knew about your kind of dyslexia and dyspraxia, or was it just kind of something you kept to yourself?
It was one of those things where I think that if you had taken any of my friends or anyone I was close with and give them the diagnosis criteria of dyspraxia or dyslexia, they would have been like, that is Siena, especially with dyspraxia. But nobody knew because teachers, and this is a problem that I have, like teachers aren't educated on special educational needs and they're not educated on how to diagnose, learning differences. And so I would be in sport and the teacher would tell me, you have to play this role on the netball team. And so I'd be doing that and they made me play like goalkeeper because I was tall. And so they were like, you know what, you just have to put your hands up and then the ball won't get by. And it was such a disaster. It was a car crash, like in slow motion just happening.
Right.
It was awful. And I remember one time my mom like videotaped it and it was so mortifying because the ball came in from one side of the court. And for whatever reason, I'm like on the other side of the court doing God knows what because I'm so uncoordinated and I can't really predict where things are going to go. Because like with some people, they'll see the ball in motion and they'll be like, okay, it's going to end up over there. But with me, I just have a different idea of where things are going because, I have a bit of, it's dyspraxia. And so I'd just be a disaster. And then kids would later come to me and say, you ruined the match. You lost the game for us.
Yeah.
It's your fault that goal went through. And then I'm there like, it's not intentional. Like, this is just, I don't know what's happening, but I tried as hard as I could. And I know that I would look like, I wasn't trying because I was just doing stuff that doesn't make sense. But I mean, I put all the effort in that I could. And I'd explain that to them. And then sometimes it would get through. And then we'd be about to start the match and the teacher would call me out and be like, yes, Sienna, try not to ruin the match this time and try not to be so like, they would call me lazy all the time. And they would think that I would purposely sabotage. Yeah. And they would accuse me of that publicly. And that's a really loaded accusation to make. And it would happen very regularly. And that was the only way that teachers could explain the fact that I was bad at sport. And it really, really got to me. And there was a time when my mom said, I'm not going to take you to any more sports days. Next time there's a sports day, we're just going to call in sick. Because we're not doing this whole, like, you have a team and you have to do all this stuff for your team. And no, it really did affect my self-esteem. And I was bullied for it. And there were friendships that fell apart because of that. And it was really, I mean, it sounds kind of pedantic and not like it really matters now because, you look at sport and you're like, oh, that's just a fun thing that you do. But for me, like my school days revolved around worrying about the next sport lesson and like preparing for it.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that is such an important and powerful statement because there are a lot of people, whether they're still in school or they're kind of had those experiences when they were in school of being bullied for something, whether it is, their, elements of special needs or just because of who they are or where they come from or their culture or their lifestyle. And a lot of times we can maybe we don't see how much it can impact a person in their upbringing, how much they can kind of pull away, how much they can feel ostracized or ridiculed for just being themselves. I mean, and I mean, being someone who's experienced this and someone who, dare I say, has a very big awareness and a positive spirit to your own experiences. I mean, what would you say or share to people who might be experiencing that in school right now, or have experienced that when they were in school? Or were there some tips or tricks that really worked for you, or just ways that you kind of dealt with it in a really positive way?
Dealt with being bullied for being different.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, at the time, it just what I would say is I remember when I was being bullied and I was, 9, 10 years old, and my world revolved around it. It was like when I woke up in the morning, it was the first thing I thought about. It was like, how is my day going to go
Yeah.
today? What are they going to say to me? What are they going to do to me? And my mom would drive me to school, and that would be the conversation. It would be, what do I do if they do this? And which teacher do I go to when they do this? And then I'd go to school, and my day would revolve around avoiding them and, structuring my time so that I wouldn't have to spend, a second with these bullies. And then, kind of watching them from the corner of my eye and being like, okay, if they come near me, I'm
Yeah.
just gonna
Go the
run.
other
And
way.
it
Yeah.
sounds so crazy, but like that was what my life was like. And then they'd do something and I'd come home, and in the car ride home, I'd talk about what they did. And then, we'd get home and I'd tell my dad what they did, and we'd be at the dining room and we'd talk about it. And it was just my whole life. Like that was what it was,
Mm.
day in, day out was my bullying story. And I was talking to my mom and we were talking about it now, 8 years later. And I forgot the name of one of the bullies. I was like, yeah, Dylan and Ryan and who was the other one? And my mom and I were sitting there and we were like, who was the other bully? And we'd completely forgotten. And there was a good moment to it because I was like, you know what? That was my life. But if I could
Yeah.
go back in time and talk to my, 8-year-old self, 9-year-old self, I would say, it's going to move on. Like right now, it feels like you're stuck in this time loop and you're never going to get past this. And this is going to be the rest of your life. But there's going to come a day where you're going to live a really happy life and you're not even going to like remember their names. It's not as big a deal as you think it is. It's not like in the future, it's going to be like whatever. And so that's what I would say, because with bullying advice, I've had lots of people giving me bullying advice, and sometimes it just doesn't work. People always say, tell the teacher when you're being bullied. And that's the big advice that they give.
Right.
Most of the time, actually every single time that I was bullied, I told the teacher about it. They didn't do anything.
Yeah. And it didn't
A lot of
stop.
the time, yeah, it didn't stop because I mean, one time I was being bullied, I told the teacher, and the teacher said, this is unacceptable. We're going to stop this. And she went to the bullies and we had a conversation. And I felt really happy about it because I'm like, okay, if this happens again, I'll go to the same teacher. Well, it did happen again. I go to the same teacher. She talks to the bullies and then she comes back to me and says, you know what? The reason they're bullying you is because you're weird. That's what they told me. They're
Really?
bullying you because you're different, because you're weird. And so, yeah, that's what she told me. And she was like, and so what you should do is try not to be weird. You should try to be like the other kids and then you won't be bullied. And I was sitting there and I'm like, is this actually happening? Like, you want me to change myself so that I don't get bullied? Like, change the bullies. They're the ones who are in the wrong. I'm just living my best life, being me. And so I went home and immediately I was like, okay, well, you know what? I'm just going to listen to what this teacher did because I don't want to get bullied anymore. And so I put every single, piece of energy that I had into changing who I was and trying to be neurotypical and, trying to present the same way as everyone else and not being weird and not being different. But the thing is, you'll be bullied for being weird or different, but you'll also be bullied for being like disingenuous. And so then I was bullied because it was like, there's something weird about you, but in a different way, because like because people could tell I was faking it. And it was just so frustrating. And so there's a lot of bullying advice that like doesn't really work because a lot of teachers, they don't care. And I've been bullied by teachers. And so there's advice like, oh, tell your teacher. I mean, I would still say do it, see if it works. Sometimes it works. Um, but I would just say try to keep your mental health strong. Something that I do a lot or have done is just leave the school, leave the environment.
Yeah.
I remember one time I was bullied ruthlessly. I was hospitalized because of panic attacks I'd had
Right.
because of the bullying. And my mom, we were in hospital, and I'm like, I just can't do this anymore. And my mom was like, okay, we're going to pull you out. Pulled me out. A week later, all the mental health stuff was gone. No more panic attacks, no more anxiety, because there was no longer the trigger. There was no longer the stimulus that was causing it. I was at home. I was in another school in a happy environment. And that really worked for me, because if I'd stayed at that school, it just would have been the same drama over and over again. Like you just feel like you're stuck in a time loop, living the same day over. And so that's another thing I would say.
Yeah, I mean, and I think what's really something that a lot of people don't realize, especially if you have been bullied in your life or you are recognized for being weird or different or unique, however you want to say it, is how much additional mental stress and energy and work there is just to exist, right? The amount of time you said that you studied how to, let's say, be normal or to be like everyone else, it just adds more and more and more weight onto your mental fatigue. And I think a big important kind of message through all this is how much all of this impacts your mental health, how much all of this has impacted the amount of additional concern towards kind of just living every single day. And I mean, it's great to hear your little bits of advice, because I think you're absolutely right that it is different for everyone. And we can't just look at it from an outsider's point of view of tell the teacher and everything will get better, or try not to act so weird and everything will get better, because everyone's situation is unique. And it is okay to walk away. It is okay to change your environment. It is okay to make a situation that actually just helps you breathe easier and feel better. So
Definitely.
yeah, and so I mean, let's talk a little bit about autism, because I think that's a really important part of this conversation, a big part of you and what you share, but even more because of how stigmatized not just it is, but how it's talked about, how it's seen in everyday life. Can we maybe start a little bit from the beginning and actually talk about just what is autism, and what are some things people should know more about it?
Okay, so autism is a social communication disorder. As part of autism, you have to have a sensory processing disorder as well. So you can have two types of sensory processing disorder. One where everything is too much, it's too bright, it's too loud. You get overwhelmed by your sensories. And other ones where you get underwhelmed. So I'm autistic, my sister is autistic. With me, I'll have a panic attack over how bright a light is. Like that's my state of sensory processing. With my sister, she has to have her clothes really tight, and
Mm.
she has to be right next to people because she's undersensitive. So she's the kind of person where she'll have a massive bruise on her arm, and I'll say, "Oh my god, like what happened to your arm?" She'll be like, "I have no idea. I didn't feel that." I'm the kind of person who can feel the wind. Like I'm
Right.
so.
Yeah.
And so I remember like growing up, we would get into a lot of squabbles because she like shoved me, and because I'm hypersensitive, I'd be like, oh my god, I'm in so much pain. And then for her, she'd be like, oh, I didn't feel it. And I'm like, how could you not feel it? Like we're very different that way. But those are two different types of sensory processing disorders you can have. And so that's really, it's a big part of the autistic experience. Like with me, when I talk about my autism, a lot of what I talk about is the sensory processing disorder that comes along with it.
And you said earlier that you were diagnosed later as you were older. And is that typical? I mean, I know from just my own personal understanding and knowledge, a lot of times kids are diagnosed earlier on, kind of when they're quite young, under 10, if not earlier. I mean, for you, what was that journey like of being diagnosed a bit older, and kind of how did that shift things for you?
Yeah, so I talk to a lot of people who are diagnosed when they're 3, 4 years old. And so they've known they had autism for as long as they can remember. And then I talked to some people who, I met this woman and she told me this story. She said, I had a son and my son, was presenting differently. And so he was diagnosed as autistic. And I bought a book to read about, autism, how I could support him. And while I was reading it, I realized that I was autistic. And so there are a lot of women, especially because women present slightly differently, who get diagnosed in their 40s. And so when I first started talking about how I was autistic and I got diagnosed when I was 12, I met one person who told me, you were diagnosed really late. Most people are diagnosed when they're 3 or 4 years old. Like everyone I know was diagnosed when they're that age. And then I talked to other people who were like, oh, you're very lucky that you got diagnosed early. I went through 40 years of my life not knowing why I was different. And it wrecked my mental health. It's a good thing you got diagnosed when you're 12. And so they're like two kind of schools of thought. I kind of think that I was diagnosed later, especially since there were many times where I came very close to getting diagnosed along the road. And there was a lot of like things that were just skipped over. Like teachers would constantly describe me in a way that ticked every single box of the diagnosis criteria. Teachers would tell me, you're different. There's something different about her. They'd say, she's weird. But if you asked her, why is Siena weird? It would be, oh, well, because she freaks out over the lights. Oh, because, she has to stay away from everyone else. She hates the cafeteria because it's too loud. That's why she's weird. And it's like, well, that's a sensory processing disorder.
Yeah.
And so, I seem to think I was diagnosed late, but other people have different opinions. I was diagnosed when I was 12, and it was just a really difficult journey. My parents always knew I had a sensory processing disorder. I remember it was a really big part of my life. I remember I went to a school, I think I was 6, and they had a jumper that you had to wear. It was part of the uniform, and it was really scratchy. And I couldn't wear it. Like it would scratch against my skin, and it would give me so much anxiety. And it felt like, someone was drilling into my spine. It was so painful and overwhelming and stressful to wear this cardigan. And I would cry over it. And my mom would try to put it on me in the morning, and it was just a lot. And then I'd take it off when I was at school, and teachers would shout at me over it. They'd be like, you need to put your cardigan on. And they would call me the drama queen. And they'd call me a diva because they were like, look, nobody likes to wear the scratchy cardigan. Why do you think you're different? And I'm like, I don't think I'm different. I just think that I'm going to start crying if I have to wear it. But obviously I couldn't communicate that because I was like 6. And so they be really rough when they were putting the cardigan on me. And so I'd start crying because they were being rough, and I had a sensory processing disorder, and it was like this endless cycle. And then they call me, they thought that it was like a fashion statement that I didn't want to wear this cardigan.
Right, okay.
And I would just get constant and it was just stuff like that, where throughout my life there've just been certain objects that caused me a lot of anxiety because of my sensory processing disorder. And it's just meant that it's like so much drama. Like I cannot even explain it. Like I remember I went to a school where you had to go to the cafeteria to get your lunch, and you had to put your thumbprint in and like sign in that way. And I couldn't go to the cafeteria because I had all this anxiety because it was too loud, and the smells were too much, and there was just a crowd of people all wanting to get lunch. And so I wouldn't go to the dining hall. And instead, I'd just, go to a quiet classroom and just spend, I'd just like read a book or something. And the teachers would be like, she has to go to the cafeteria. She has to get lunch. She hasn't signed in. And they'd send my mom these emails, and they'd be like, these are the days that she didn't sign in. And because it was a thumbprint, like I couldn't ask somebody else to sign in for me or do anything. Because in other situations, I've been like, hey, can you just put my name down? And it was just awful. And the problem is, when you're not diagnosed, it's really hard to explain. Like I'd be sitting in a room and they'd be like, why aren't you going to the cafeteria? And I would literally have to look them in the eye and be like, because the smell is too much. And they'd laugh at me.
Yeah.
They'd be like, what do you mean the smell is too much? Like they'll call me a princess and all this stuff. And it really meant that I would come home and I'd be like, why am I so different? Like, why do I have this problem? Like everyone else in the school, I'm in a school with 2,000 people. Every other person can sign in. I'm the one person who has a problem with this. And my mom and I were just like really confused by it. And it got to the point where, you know, my mom realized like this isn't like an attention seeking thing, because this is very negative attention. Like, I don't know why anybody would want to go through all of this, you know, this whole production over stuff like this. And so she ended up getting me diagnosed with a sensory processing disorder.
Yeah.
And when I was there, the person who was diagnosing me was like, this is actually really severe. Like, she's getting a lot of pain just from like touching her. And the person who was diagnosing me was like, this is bad. Like, you're going to need to go to a pain management specialist, because, you know, I haven't seen anything like this. So I go to the pain management specialist, and she's like, okay, we're going to have to do a lot of work, because, you know, I can see why you have so much anxiety and why all of these things are causing you a problem. And she explained to me that my pain management is linked, that the sensory processing and the pain I was experiencing was linked to my anxiety. So if I have high anxiety, then my sensory processing disorder gets worse. And so all of a sudden, when I'm really anxious, I can hear the electricity in the walls.
Yeah. Right.
And I can feel my heartbeat. And if you can hear the electricity in the walls, like the sound of the tube is just going to drive you up the wall, kind of thing. And so I was at this point in my life where I couldn't leave the house because my sensory processing disorder was so bad. And what happens is your anxiety gets worse, then your sensory processing disorder gets worse, and then you get anxiety because your sensory processing
So
disorder
it's an
gets
endless
worse.
loop. It becomes a loop. Yeah.
Yeah, it's this endless cycle, and there's no way, and it feels like there's like no way to get out of it, because how do you like reduce your anxiety? And so I was constantly trying to figure out all these methods to calm myself down, and we tried everything. We tried lavender oil, we tried all these different. I remember one time my mom got me doing this tapping thing, and so I would do tapping, and I would say things like, "Oh, it's going to be okay," and that worked. And I would go to school, and I'd be in class, and I'd be like doing my tapping, because it worked. It was the one thing that worked. And I'm like, look, you can judge me for doing my tapping, but like, would you rather I have a panic attack or do my tapping? And that was the way I would do it, because I'd be like, look, I mean, it's more embarrassing than to have like a full-blown panic attack in the middle of class than to just be sitting here doing this. And so, you know, I managed to get my anxiety under control. And then once that was under control, I could manage my sensory processing disorder, and I could come up with strategies and figure things out. And then all of a sudden, my autism became so much more manageable. I didn't say how I got diagnosed. I got diagnosed because my pain management therapist was talking to me, and she was like, tell me about your anxiety, we need to manage that. And so I told her about my anxiety, and I told her I was having all these social issues. She was like, well, you know, you could be autistic, because autistic people have to have a sensory processing disorder, and so you've got that. And you're telling me that you're having some social issues, and people are calling you weird and different, and you're having all these problems. And so she was like, you could have a social communication disorder. And so then I got diagnosed with autism.
Oh, and I mean, were you relieved in some way?
I was so relieved. I was so happy. People often ask me, like, how did you feel? And sometimes they think, like, say, it was awful, my life was over. I felt like, oh, I had this problem with me. But no, I was so happy to be autistic, like so happy. And I still am. I'm so proud of my autism. And that's why I call my book, you know, How to Grow Up Awesome and Autistic, because, you know, my autism makes me awesome. And you can, you know, it shouldn't be a bad thing to be autistic. And for me, when I was diagnosed, it felt like all the problems I was having, they weren't just me. You know, because before I felt like I'm the only person in the world who has to watch all these videos and tutorials and, you know, body language classes to figure out how to say hello to somebody. I'm the only person who has to do that, you know, because I was watching, you know, movies, and I was watching, you know, I found this YouTube site that talked about, you know, different cultures. And so it was like, this is how, you know, in one culture, you do, you know, a greeting this way. And then this is how you do the greeting in, you know, Western culture. And so I'd watch those videos so I could see how you do greetings in, it was so crazy, the stuff that I was doing, just to learn how to interact with people. And for everyone else, it came so naturally. And I knew I was different, and I knew that there was something off with that. And I felt really isolated and really alone, and I didn't know how to communicate to people that I was having these issues. Like, I didn't know how to tell somebody, you know what, I script the majority of conversations I have, and I need to practice every, interaction, every facial expression. They don't come naturally. And so I just keep it to myself because I didn't want people to think that something was wrong with me. And then when I was finally diagnosed and I was able to go online and read about people who were having the same problems, people who had the same experience, I didn't feel so alone. I felt like I was part of a community. And that just did wonders for my mental health and self-esteem, because there was no longer this whole I kind of gave myself a stigma around it, because I'm like, you shouldn't have to be doing this. And then all of a sudden that kind of went away, and I'm like, okay, I have a social communication disorder, and we're going to manage it. And there are all these tips and tricks that other people are doing. And then I just became really empowered and really happy to be autistic, and I'm proud of my autism.
Hey guys, welcome to this week's T2 Tea Break, which is, as always, our moment to pause, sit back, and enjoy a cup together. Now, Nikki's here, our resident tea lover and show producer, and together we're going to talk about this month some of T2's most loved teas, which are the breakfast teas. Now, these are all black teas, and they're 100% sustainably sourced, and their tea bags are made entirely from plant-based sources, so we know we can feel good with every sip, which is great. This week, we're going to talk about New York breakfast, which is what I've got in front of me. And Nikki, I know you've got in front of you. What do you think?
I really like this tea. I was quite lucky enough to have a chat with Michelle, who's the sommelier at T2, and she told me a little bit about this tea and how it came to be. So I'm going to tell you a little story about what the tea is and how it happened. So the idea with this is that you are walking down the road in New York, a cold winter's day, and you pop in somewhere and you think, oh, do you know what, I really fancy a good stack of hot pancakes with some maple syrup on. And that's where this tea would take you. It has all of the things in there that have those same flavors. So a little bit of cinnamon, a little bit of the black tea, and then this vanilla as well. Those flavors all together just create this profile which really resembles the taste of a pancake.
It sounds so good, and I can tell you it tastes just as good. Now, for me, I'm kind of pretty simple in how I make my teas: hot water and a splash of milk. But I know you've made yours a little bit different today. What's in it?
So this one is slightly different, like you said. So I've got 2 tea bags in here, so it's nice and strong. And then I've done half hot water, brew it for 4 minutes, so it's really strong. Take out the tea bags and then mix it with half of frothy milk. So just like you were making a latte, add a bit of salt and a little bit of sweetener. And again, it's just that it enhances it a little bit more, makes it nice and creamy and light, and it really does transport you to this pancake flavor. The frothy milk kind of resembles the texture of the fluffy pancake, and then you've got all those nice sweet flavors. I feel like I'm in New York right now.
All right, guys, well, you heard it. There's lots of different ways to enjoy this tea. You can try it both ways or any way. And this goes to show that T2 has some amazing taste and flavors in their teas. But also what I love about it is that they have a continued focus with sustainability. And that really shows through in the packaging, the way it's sourced, delivered, and put together. And I think that's really inspired. As well as what I do love about this specific tea, the New York breakfast, is that they've transitioned to plant-based poly bags. Right, so inside the box where the tea bags are inside a plastic bag, you would think it's plastic, but it's not. And even those little touches are great steps forward for a really great sustainable cause. Now, for you guys listening at home, you can find out lots more about their sustainability journey. You can find out more about this black tea or all the black teas in the range by just simply logging onto the website at t2tea.com. So check it out, give it a go, get inspired, and make sure you try the teas. They're really, really great. All right, guys, well, that's it for this tea break. Thanks, Nikki, as always, for being here. And in these last moments, as always, just take a moment to sit back, to pause, and to just breathe. All right, guys, let's get back to the conversation. That's such a beautiful story and so inspiring. I'm genuinely blown away. To hear that, I think it's very easy for people listening and myself to sit here, to hear, this sense of conversation around autism, right? Because we have grown up knowing or been told by the media or been told just by movies that there is this negativity, this stigma that it is a bad thing. And to hear that actually you were relieved, you were happy that you had a name to it, a permission to be yourself, a sense of community that came with it is such a, dare I say, a new perspective for autism in the best possible way. Why do you think it has such a negative stigma? Why do you think it is kind of seen as kind of almost like something that is just not a good thing?
I think it's because people don't understand it. If I were to go back to all of my teachers at primary school and secondary school, the teachers who were calling me a diva and all that, if I'd gone to them and say, you know what, I have autism, I don't think that would change their perspective. I think they'd still be like, well, you're a really difficult child. Because the thing is, people don't, a lot of the time, people just create their own assumptions. Like if you see a kid, crying in the grocery store and throwing a tantrum, a lot of people just walk by and think, oh, the parent doesn't know how to discipline their kid. Oh, that kid's badly behaved. They don't think, oh, well, that kid has a sensory processing disorder. That means that everything he sees is twice as bright and twice as loud, and everything he hears is twice as loud, and it just got overwhelming. And they're not kind of like, okay, let me just not make these assumptions. And throughout my life, so many assumptions were made that were incredibly negative. And I think that if I was able to sit down and explain to people, like, this is why I react in this way, things would have been different. Like if I'd been able to explain to my teacher who would make fun of me because the lights were too bright, if I were able to explain to her, like, they are really bright, like they are so bright that I'm getting black spots in my vision and my heart rate is going up and I'm about to have a panic attack because it's just so overwhelming. If I'd been able to explain that to her and give her the kind of like a kind of medical explanation, like this is a real thing, this isn't just me being a drama queen, maybe that would change a bit and they wouldn't have this assumption of like, oh, well, she's just like attention seeking, because it's not attention seeking if you've got like an underlying reason. And I think that that's the thing, people don't really understand it, and so they come up with their own story, and that's true for ADHD. I remember when I was first diagnosed with ADHD, I told a teacher, and she told me, ADHD doesn't exist. It's just parents who don't know how to parent their children properly, and so their children are out of control, and then they're embarrassed because they have out of control children, and so they come up with this fake diagnosis so that then they don't look like bad parents.
And how old were you at this age when you were diagnosed with ADHD?
I was 15.
Right. So
let me just say I was really well behaved as a kid. Like I was 15, I was not like, and so for her to say that, it was so hurtful.
And irresponsible and unfair. I mean, I would guess that your teacher wasn't a medical professional. She wasn't a clinician who was able to make those diagnoses. I think there's a huge conversation about irresponsibility of labeling, children or younger adults just because of our own judgments or assumptions or ways that we see the world, because it does have such an impact on people's well-being and mental health. I mean, hearing these stories from you, and again, I'm we're on video as well, and obviously for a lot of people who are listening just through audio, I mean, you are well composed, inspired, positive, bright. I mean, you have this beautiful charm about you, but also, to share these stories, it almost sitting here on my side of going, wow, like you are so amazingly empowered, in your words, through this journey, when there is not just one, but many different moments you've had in your life that could have kind of bumped you sideways or made you feel really, kind of let down or depressed or kind of hurt. And I think it's really great to see not only your journey, but to hear how much not only you've experienced, but your willingness to talk about it and share, because I think there are so many people who either are experiencing this or have experienced, but just keep it to themselves or believe what they're told by maybe by someone else's opinions or someone else's points of view. And I think these are conversations that we do need to hear more of. But one thing I did want to ask, because I think it is a really positive aspect to your whole journey, is that you've said it throughout this conversation, is that you had a really supportive mom and a really supportive family. What was that like? And do you think that was a really big asset through all of these kind of experiences for you?
It was a really, really big asset. No, I mean, recently I graduated from school.
Congratulations.
And thank you. No, I mean, it was a journey. No, and it wasn't very eventful because it was just on a Zoom call, and the teacher ended it and was like, well, I guess you graduated now.
Right.
So it wasn't much, but I remember it was a really big moment because for a lot of my life, I didn't think I was going to finish school. And that's not because I struggled academically. Like throughout my life, I was an academic scholar at some point. I had to leave the school because of bullying, but I was an academic scholar. I have 3 A stars at A level, which is the highest grade you can get.
Amazing.
I worked really hard, and I had good grades, but I just couldn't handle the bullying, and I couldn't handle teachers just being awful to me and all the stigma. And so for a long time, I thought, there's a good chance that I'm not going to finish school. And to finally get to the other end, it was amazing. And the reason that I was able to finish it was like 100% my mom. It was a specialist math school, and the colors of the school were white and neon yellow. And the school had these skylights. And so what would happen is the light would hit white or neon yellow because they designed the school, they especially designed the school. I've been to other schools where they just they have a building that already exists and they just move in. Here they painted all the walls white and neon yellow.
Right.
And the light would hit from the skylight and it would be bright. Like neurotypical people would find it overwhelming, and I'm over there like having a panic attack because of the color of the wall kind of thing.
Yeah.
And people didn't care. People didn't want to hear that. People were like, you just have to deal with it. I was older. I was in sixth form, so I was 16, and people were like, you need to grow up. And my mom would sit outside the school for the whole day. So she'd drive me to school, and then she'd stay there. And I would come during lunch breaks, and I'd come when I had a free period, and I'd come when I had, a break in the morning, and I'd be like, oh my God, I need to get away from the neon lights. And we'd have these conversations, and she'd like calm me down, and she'd be like, okay, you need to go back into class, you need to go back into math, and you need to be like relaxed, and we need to do the tapping. And she would literally sit in the car outside someone's house, get all this judgment because people were like, why are you sitting in the car for like 7 hours straight? And she'd sit there with my dog, doing this tapping for like an hour. And she put up with it, and honestly, she deserves a gold medal for it.
What an amazing mom! Yeah.
I mean, it was next level. Like the stuff she's done. I went to a school in Sevenoaks, which is middle of nowhere. Mm-hmm. It's like 2 hours using the tube and the train from London. And what happened was I wanted to be a boarder there. I don't know why. I was obsessed with being a boarder when I was younger because I felt like my social issues would go away if I were.
And a boarder is where you live at the school. Is that right?
Yeah, because basically when I was at home, my mom knew I had a sensory processing disorder before I was diagnosed. Like she knew that I found things really bright and really loud. And so home was a very, sensory safe environment, very sensory friendly. My parents would be very careful about making loud noises and the whole thing. And so I was slightly different when I was at home because I didn't have the anxiety, and so I was more myself and I could have fun conversations. And so I felt like I didn't know that it was because of the sensory processing. I just thought that, when I'm not at school, I'm a different person. I'm more fun to be around. And so I thought, why don't I go to boarding school? And then I'll be able to make friends because I'll be, more fun when I'm not at school. And so that was this rationale I had. It was completely wrong. Well, I applied to be a boarder. I'd been a boarder previously. It didn't work out, but I decided I wanted to be a boarder at Seven Oaks because it was so far away that I couldn't possibly commute there every day. That was my rationale. I didn't get a place as a boarder. They gave me an academic scholarship, but they told me you cannot be a boarder because there's something weird about you. That was literally what the head of the boarding house said. She was like, yeah, she can't be a boarder. There's just something off. And I was really offended by this. But the woman did me the greatest favor ever because it would have been a disaster if I'd been a boarder. But I had to commute, 2-3 hours sometimes one way. And that was using the tube and the train. I had this sensory processing disorder, like a complete, it got really, really bad. It like flared up to the point where I couldn't use the tube anymore. And so my mom would drive me, and it was like a 5-hour drive.
Wow.
And she would drive me the whole way there, and we'd have to wake up at like 4 a.m. sometimes.
Wow.
And she'd stay there because she couldn't possibly like drive back. And then she'd and pick me up again. And so she'd stay there for the whole day, and then she'd pick me up and we'd drive back. And it was an odyssey to get there. And she'd have to take all these side roads. And it was real commitment, and I wouldn't have gotten through this whole
Your mom sounds amazing, yeah.
No, she's like legendary. And she was really open-minded as well. She really wanted me to get diagnosed. She wanted the best for me, and she's done some crazy stuff. She's taken me to like really weird places in the middle of nowhere to get help for my sensory processing. And she's constantly like researching stuff, and she'll be like, I remember she researched and she found a weighted blanket. And a weighted blanket is basically like what it says in the box. It's just a blanket that's like,
yeah, they're great.
And she was like, you have to buy this because a lot of people with autism and sensory processing disorders are saying this is really good. But she couldn't get one in England. And so the next time my dad went to the States, she had to coordinate it so that it would be shipped to his hotel and that he could bring it back. And he did an extra suitcase because it was so heavy.
Oh.
And she organized the whole thing. And she was like, we're going to put all the stuff in weighted blanket. No, she does a lot of stuff. And the weighted blanket was legendary. Like if you have a sensory processing disorder, you need to get a weighted blanket.
Yeah,
they're like amazing.
They are great.
No, but like, I mean, I think that's a lot of people who are autistic have, parents who are really supportive. And my mom got a lot of stigma for being, so involved in my life. People would call her like a helicopter parent. And they say, she sits outside the school all day. Like, what is wrong with her? Like, she can't let her child go. She's so obsessed with Siena that she can't let her out of her sight. This is so crazy. And people would tell her that. And she told that you just need to let Siena grow up. You've got to let her do her thing. Like, why are you waiting outside the school for her for like 8 hours? And my mom would do it anyway. And she would just deal with all that stigma and deal with all of that. And no, she's a real legend. I really appreciate her.
I mean, your mom sounds amazing, first of all, and I think it is an amazing story of inspiration and support and parenting to hear the lengths that you guys went through together. Those long trips to school and kind of really being positively proactive and proud of you. There's a lot of people who might be listening that are parents or are soon to be parents, or they might have, they have this, again, these stigmas or thoughts or preconceptions about autism. I mean, if I was to ask you in kind of just like a one little kind of little nugget of wisdom to share with parents if they have autistic children, or if they have kids who are showing similar kind of experiences. I mean, what would you say to those parents?
I would say, listen to your kid. One thing that I hear a lot is, I like to give this example. If you lined up 100 people who were all dyslexic, we'd all stay the same story. We'd all be like, oh yeah, we have issues with our spelling, and some of us have issues with our reading. It would all be the same. If you line up 100 people who are autistic, it's all a different story. Like my sister and I are completely different in our sensory processing disorders. We have completely different experiences with our autism. And a lot of times there's confusion because people will read stories online about an autistic person and something that autistic person did that helped them, and they'll think, okay, so this is going to help my kid because they're both autistic. And a lot of the time, you can do harm that way, even if, you're well-intended, just because, stuff that works for my sister did not work for me. Like, she has jackets that are really tight that help her, like, understand her spatial awareness and her perception. And if you put that same tight jacket on me, I'd have a panic attack. And so it's very important to just listen to your child. And when they say, this is what I need, this is the support I need, just helping guide them.
Yeah, I think that's a really good piece of inspiration and a really good insight. And it really goes to show, whether it is, a child with autism or, any child with autism or anyone with dealing with dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD, there is an element of listening that is so vital to people's well-being. Now, as I said earlier, and as we mentioned earlier, I mean, you have such a positivity and empowerment around this conversation, and it is such a joy to have a chat with you. And right behind you, I can see your book, and you've showed it a few times. Where did that come from? How did that come about? Tell me a little bit about the book.
Yeah, so I had my website, QL Mentoring, which I started when I was 13. And that was a website where I just put tips and tricks on, how to be successful at school with ADHD, autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, just little things that I'd learned along the way. And I started getting very involved in girls with autism because girls present differently and there are not many resources for girls. And I would go online and I would try to find information. And people would say stuff that, I disagree with. Like, for instance, there's this notion that's going around and in the academic community and with autism experts as well, where people say girls are less likely to have autism, and I disagree with that. I think girls are far less likely to get diagnosed, and that's why the numbers are different. But I think there are just as many girls with autism as men with autism, and the only difference in like how many are getting diagnosed is the diagnosis criteria and the idea that people have around autism. Because I've met many men and boys with autism who present the exact same way, or like a very similar way to the way Rain Man presents and the way the guy from the Big Bang presents. And that they're far more likely to get diagnosed because it fits in with the media's
standard criteria, yeah, the perception.
And so teachers are far more likely to be like, oh, I recognize that. That sounds familiar. Than with girls. And so I wanted to create, a book for girls so that they could, get advice, because a lot of people weren't giving advice specifically for girls because they thought it was such a small target audience. And something that was important to me is the few books that do exist for women are like written by men.
Right.
Like men who are neurotypical. Like, I read this one book for teen girls with autism, and it was really weird because it was very clinical, and it was written by a neurotypical man in his 40s. And I'm like, what is a neurotypical man in his 40s? Like, what can he contribute to like a teenage girl with autism? Like, in every way, it's like
yeah.
situation. And it's always like very clinical. It's like, this is the reason that you do this.
Yeah.
But because they don't have the experience, because they're neurotypical.
Yeah. It's the what, it's not the why.
Yeah, it's not like, this is how I can help you out. These are tips and tricks. And this is something that I've done, and this is something that can help you, because I don't have that experience. And so I wanted to write a book. And it's actually the first book ever for teen autistic girls written by a teen autistic girl, which I think is crazy. I think it should have been done before. But it's the Spectrum Girl Survival Guide, How to Grow Up Awesome and Autistic. And what was really important to me is that it's an empowering guide. There's a lot of stigma towards having autism, and a lot of people expect me to, be ashamed of my autism, but I'm not. The way I like to think of it is, if I were on a desert island and I were just by myself, my autism would give me no problems. The only reason I have problems is because the world is designed in a way that isn't autism friendly, and people are mean to me. Like, that's the only reason that I have problems with my autism. When I'm alone, and I have, my sensory processing's set up, and I have, the lights that don't bother me, and, I make sure that there are noises that don't bother me. I'm perfectly happy, and I'm really happy with my autism because I have a real passion for math that comes from my autism. And I can just sit and I can do hours of math and just be really happy and really content. And, I don't have to deal with all this other stuff that comes with being neurotypical and all this like drama and all this like, because there's a lot that goes into having friendships and having these whole like group, like having, I know a lot of neurotypical people who need to be around other people, like especially during this pandemic. My sister, who has a lot of friends who aren't autistic, are like getting a lot of mental health problems because they can't be alone. They need to be around other people in order to feel happy, and they need to communicate to other people. And if they go a day without talking to people, they find that distressing. And then I'm here like, I haven't like really talked to anybody properly for like 100 days. Like I can spend, I live alone in Liverpool now, and I'll do these podcasts and I'll send emails out, but I can spend like 4 days just in my own head, and I'm perfectly happy.
Yeah.
And it's stuff like that where I'm really content to be autistic. Like it really does. It improves my life. And it makes me who I am. It changes the way I perceive the world. I see things brighter and louder, and it changes the world, the way, I experience things and the way I react to things, and it makes me who I am.
That's amazing. I mean, it is really amazing. And obviously for you guys listening, we will put the link to the book in the show notes and share some photos of it as well on the post and the feed. I mean, what I'm really inspired the most about through this conversation is not just your journey, but actually your willingness to support other people. You've obviously written the book, and tell me about the Neurodiversity Celebration Week, which I know you've started, which is another project of things you work on.
Yeah, so I was having a lot of people contacting me and saying, schools need to change. I'm having all these issues at school, and no matter how I apply the advice that you have on your QR mentoring website, nothing is changing because the teachers are just awful and they don't understand what I'm going through. And so I decided that I wanted to run an event that takes place at school. And there are 3 aims, to educate teachers on neurodiversity so that they can diagnose, kids in their class. Well, not but just like flag it up so that the kids can get formally diagnosed. And then they know why they need to make reasonable adjustments, and they're just more accepting and understanding. And then to diagnose neurotypical peers so that they can be more understanding as well, and maybe less likely to bully and stigmatize individuals. And then to empower neurodiverse individuals. And so I have many, activities that you can do. I have posters that you can put up on the wall. I have, plans that you can do for assemblies, and schools can do whatever they want with it. They can, there's some schools that designate a whole week and do all the activities I have on my website and do assemblies every day. And there are other schools that will just do a few assemblies instead. But I just want to spread the message. And I've had a lot of really positive stories come from it. I had one kid who I always talk about. He had ADHD. He has ADHD. And he was at a school where the teachers would say horrible things to him. They'd tell him like, oh, well, since you can't sit still in class, you're never going to accomplish anything. You're not going to be successful. How can you possibly sit still in an office or a work environment if you can't do it here? And he, it really got to his head, and he had really bad mental health problems because he felt like, well, I'm just not going to be anybody. I'm going to be unemployed. No one's going to want me to work for them. And I'm going to have this terrible life when I'm older. And then through my Neurodiversity Week, he was shown all these people who are incredibly successful because of their neurodiversity. Like Emma Watson has ADHD. Justin Bieber has ADHD. I'm not a Justin Bieber fan, but many people are. And Justin Bieber, when he talks about it, he's like, it gives me my creativity. And Justin Timberlake as well has ADHD, and he says, it makes me a good artist. It gave me my success. And so this boy with ADHD, all of a sudden, his ideas around it changed. And instead of thinking, my ADHD is going to ruin me, it was like, oh, this is going to make me successful. And so far, I have 530,000 students signed up from
Wow.
160 schools. So I'm really happy about it.
Amazing. That is
Yeah.
huge,
Or,
huge,
yeah,
huge.
I know. I don't know how I agree with that, but I'm really happy about it. I just want as many people to hear the message as possible. And I've got companies and organizations also signed up, and I've got tons of sponsors. And so I'm just really happy that it grew
That
this.
is that is absolutely amazing. And I mean, I very much look forward to finding out more. We'll put lots of links in the show notes and on the website. That's just amazing. So, I mean, you probably, you don't need my congratulations of the work you're doing. It is absolutely fantastic to hear this in this kind of in the work that you're doing. So super job. I mean, this is a conversation. I mean, I've loved so much, and I mean, I could speak to you for a longer time, and I'm sure there's lots more things that people listening would love to ask. But I did want to wrap it up and round it off, because it is, I think, a great way to kind of bring the conversation to a close. I mean, two questions, and one is about you, and one is about just kind of autism in the future. I mean, what is the future? I mean, what's the future hold for you now? I mean, you've just graduated, or you've moved to Liverpool. Are you working, university, writing a new book, working on things? I mean, what is life like for you now and in the future?
I'm taking a gap year. I'm working on, marketing my book. I'm going to start tutoring. Okay, so another thing that I'm really passionate about is STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. That's what I'm like so into, and that's what I want to do at university. But there's a real underrepresentation of women in the sciences, and it's a real problem. And so I want to mentor and tutor underprivileged girls in science subjects, and I'll do it for free. And so I'm working on setting that up. And just more neurodiversity work, or on the next neurodiversity celebration week, and just more podcasts and all of that. I just want to get the message out there. I feel like I'm getting traction, and I want people to, change their ideas around neurodiversity.
That's amazing. I mean, it was such a great conversation to have. I mean, I do want to let you know that, I would love to support any way that I can, that we can, with Just Breathe. And I think this is, the beginning of many things that we can collaborate on to really kind of make these messages impactful. My last question for you is, I mean, just on this conversation of autism, I mean, what is one action that you'd encourage people listening to really help support, improve, people with autism, or the conversations around autism, or the communities around autism? What is something, or what is one thing that we can all learn from you that we can start to bring into our lives?
I mean, it's not unique to autism, but just to be kinder and more, generous in general, because I've had a lot of issues along the way where, I've forgotten the names of some of the bullies who have been awful to me, but I actually haven't forgotten the names of the people who were nice to me along the way. I had people who I didn't have a place to sit at lunch, and who would say, come sit next to me. I've had people who, helped me out, and it's just it really makes a difference in someone's day and in someone's life when you can just be kind to people. And, when you're autistic and you're having, I had one situation where I had a panic attack on the tube, and it was awful, because there was an element of, I'm trapped here because the tube was moving. And so there was no, like, I'm just going to leave this environment that's giving me all this anxiety. And it was in public, and it was embarrassing. And I had someone who came and helped me. And that was something that was just so kind, and, really changed the way things would have worked out. And like, just to have someone to stand up and be kind to other people. And so that's something that I always tell people. And so just try to live your life with kindness, and that can really have an impact.
I think that is a beautiful, beautiful answer, and something that we can all remember often, no matter who we are, where we are, whatever our situation is in life, is that kindness will always be the best way forward. Siena, thank you so much for joining on this episode of the podcast. It's been a real joy to have this conversation. For you guys listening at home, if you want to find out more, and I hope you do, about Siena's work and her book, you can follow along on her IG, which is QL Mentoring. You can check out her website, which is neurodiversity-celebration-week.com. And obviously, there's a lot of other things that you can find out about her and her work by just looking at the show notes and on our website. And as well, make sure you pick up a copy of her new book, The Spectrum Girls Survival Guide, How to Grow Up Awesome and Autistic. And we will make sure that it is as easy to find as possible for all of you guys listening in. Siena, thank you so much. Any last words?
No, I've really enjoyed talking to you, and thank you so much for just shining a spotlight to autism and neurodiversity.
Amazing. Well, thanks guys for listening in, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. Again, as always, I'm your host, Michael James Wong, on this episode of The Quiet Life. And if it was enjoyable for you and you got something valuable from it, please continue to listen in, subscribe on Apple and Spotify, and we will see you guys next time on The Quiet Life.